Morning, good afternoon. Welcome everybody, wherever you are around the world. My name is Rob Mander from RSM International, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody to the fifth in our series of webinars on the future of mobility. Today, we're going to step a little wider than we've done previously in our series, and we're going to discuss how ESG is impacting global mobility. It's probably fair to say that the effects of the pandemic are moving somewhat further into the background, and ESG is very much now at the forefront of discussions that surround the challenges that face businesses that have internationally active employees. And we're going to look at some of the key topics to consider under those three pillars of environment, social, and governance today. We're going to have a panel discussion now, and then we're going to have some time for some Q&A. So please drop a note of any of those questions you have in the Q&A function, and we'll look forward to dealing with those. So I'm really delighted to be joined by some of my global colleagues, and we've got a really good cross-section in our team today. We've got Joanne Webber, who's a global employer tax partner at RSM UK. We've got Brian James, who's Director of Global Employer Services at RSM in the Netherlands. And we've got Marleen Jans from RSM Netherlands as well, who's Director of Corporate Governance and Culture there. And Rich Hawke, who's Head of Sustainability at the UK ESG team. So yeah, welcome to you all.
Thanks.
And what I would like to do, just to kind of put all of our discussions into context, go to you first, Rich, from your role as Head of Sustainability. I'd just like to get that broader perspective for everyone in our audience to kind of understand, firstly, what are you seeing as you work with all of your clients? And, what's the rationale behind organizations that are now approaching all of the issues around ESG? So what's driving what they're doing, and what are you seeing, Rich?
So yeah, thanks, Rob. There's, as you've alluded to, it's a core topic at board level at the moment. So it's every organisation that we speak to, irrespective of size, it's right at the centre of what they're thinking about. Now that might be because they set their own targets. It could be because they're looking at some kind of refinancing, or it could be because there's some kind of supply chain pressure, or because they see it's the right thing to do when they want to be talking about more than just making a profit. But fundamentally, what it is it's a mix of risk and opportunities. A lot of organisations are now looking at it from an opportunity to use ESG to grow top line performance, but crucially build the financial resilience of the organisation, but also to look at some of the risks, and there are some big risks out there at the moment, and I guess chief amongst them at the moment is climate change, and that is driving a lot of focus at major government level, but then at an industrial level as well, and a corporate level. So we are working across the piece on everything from defining ESG strategies with an organisation, so looking at that environment, social and the governance side, working around some of those key stakeholders, so suppliers, government, the investors, general public, employees and the lenders, and then the customers as well, to try and work out what the really key topics for the organisations are to focus across ESG, and then work through in terms of what's the strategy, what's the impacts likely to be, what are the risk management arrangements around that. That's from the sort of advisory side, and then we're doing an awful lot of reporting and actually assurance of the reporting. So where we're seeing claims around green products, or we're seeing claims around credentials, and that could be equality, diversity, inclusion. It could become some kind of carbon reduction target, for instance, but we're now seeing organisations being held to account on their ESG credentials. So we're providing that assurance that effectively says that they're doing the right things, and what they're doing is what it says on the tin. So that's the kind of key driver at the moment, Rob, is that mix of complexer agenda, and then working out where the real opportunities and risks to your organisation lie.
Rich, maybe I can just ask you a follow-up on that last point there on the reporting. Is that being driven internally? Is it driven externally? Does that depend on the subject matter we're talking about? And I guess wrapping that around, has that changed over the last few years?
So it's a bit of both. So there are a lot of voluntary standards, if we like, but they're almost de facto standards now. So something like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, an awful lot of organisations are reporting on those now and using that framework. There are lots of others as well, depending on the region that you're in. So whether you're in the EU or the UK or the US, there's starting to be some reporting criteria required in annual reporting accounts. So certainly from a UK perspective, that's a big driver. But the voluntary reporting sector has been there for some time. So it's been driven by just this amount of information that these key stakeholders want around your organisation. So some of it is legislation, but it's this demand for, are you doing the right thing, which is driving some of that voluntary reporting as well.
Yeah, thank you. Stakeholders is an interesting one, and we might come back to that later in the discussion. You mentioned a whole range of different stakeholders. And Brian, I was just going to drop down in the detail a little bit from Rick setting the scene for us there. And I'm thinking about particularly the employment relationship. So I just wanted to come to you first about kind of the environmental aspects, which is kind of one of the more obvious things, I suppose, when we talk about something like global mobility. So is that something you're seeing, rising concerns and the impacts of travel? Is that, you know, as you look at it and you deal every day with global employers, is that changing the way they manage, you know, their whole international travel model?
Thanks, Rob. I think, yeah, there's an increasing awareness with companies with internationally mobile employees surrounding particularly travel, maybe not even just international travel, but also domestic travel. For example, in Europe, we're seeing a lot of companies considering travel by rail instead of travel by air, because that's an obvious one to reduce the CO2 emissions. Maybe also reducing even the frequency of travel is something that we're seeing. Sustainable forms of domestic travel, a shift from maybe gas vehicles to electric vehicles. There are even countries that are supporting that with all types of subsidies, and actually, I call them reverse subsidies on if you are going to continue to use gas vehicles, then there's going to be a limitation on what your deductibility is, for example, for corporate income tax purposes, and all of this. I think there is that increasing awareness that international travel is not sustainable in the current form. So countries or companies are looking for alternatives to that. Add into the mix the governmental measures that are helping stimulate. So I think it's a matter of time before companies start adding these to their policy, shaping their international mobile policies, and getting to that. A bridge to maybe something else is that we're just looking at maybe the travel aspect, but another thing that comes into play is maybe when individuals are going on a longer term assignment, companies are also evaluating what they need to do with the shipment of household goods. So that's also something that we're seeing being discussed definitely with respect to that international mobility.
That's an interesting one, isn't it, Brian? Because the global mobility, you know, I suppose automatically people think about travel, but there's those other aspects that you allude to, which, you know, probably equally important.
Correct, Rob. And I think at the end of the day, it's about finding a proper balance and a good way forward in getting that down into policies. I mean, obviously, it's not a zero-sum game, I think, whatever alternative you choose. If there's going to be working from home, then there's obviously an incremental cost. At the same time, you're reducing the travel. So, yeah, I think stuff like that is all something that needs to be taken into consideration. It's much deeper than just looking at the form of travel and over the reduction of travel.
think for me, Brian, it really brings home for employers and I guess employees as well, the real need to consider what's the central purpose of the international assignment. You know, what are the objectives from a business point of view? What are the objects from a career development point of view? What are the objects from a learning point of view? And, you know, is the traditional assignment model and the way in which, you know, that could be best achieved?
Yeah, I agree, Rob. I think just to add on to the whole travel and maybe shipment side, there's also companies that are now encouraging people to look for maybe more sustainable housing when they go on assignment abroad. Maybe and maybe not just shipping the whole household over, but just certain items that you really want to have, but also encourage them to look for sustainable furnishing alternatives in the host country. There's even an aspect, if you think through, of recyclability, so at the end of the assignment, if you have managed to have sustainable alternatives to your household goods, they can actually be passed on or transferred to the next assignment, or even internally within the company, whatever works. Also, the increase in number of virtual assignments and or creating more balance between business travel and virtual meetings can also help reduce that side of the CO2 and the sustainability objectives of the company. I think also that the pandemic taught us that we can basically work from home or work from anywhere in certain sectors. So adapting policies to that, I think, would be key. But it starts, of course, and Marlene will touch on that a bit later. How do you want to do this? How do you want to form these policies? What is going to be your governance structure? And what is your strategy in that sense? And just to close off, it's not about creating the perfect situation. I don't think personally that exists, but it's about optimizing the efforts and follow through on all the items and the items that will impact the environment.
No, exactly. And there's you know, so many of these decisions, there's a trade-off. And just before we go to Marlene, Joe, I'd just like to come to you and talk about perhaps some of these I guess the social aspects. I mean, that's a big topic. There's a lot of different considerations, and as Rich sort of alluded to in his introduction, a whole range of different issues to be taken into account. I'd just be interested in your experience as to how, you know, your global clients are looking at these issues around the sort of social aspects that they need to consider in that whole mix of how they manage their global mobility programs.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. You know, as you've just mentioned, and as Rich covered at the outset, it's a huge area, just taking the S on its own. But certainly when we're talking to our clients about global mobility, that they are at the moment looking at global mobility policies, thinking of revising those, thinking about how they might fit into kind of the new talent strategy of the organization, and also taking the opportunity to make sure that they're considering, you know, the social aspects of ESG. So the ways that we're sort of seeing that happen are around kind of equal opportunities, diversity and inclusion, making sure that those considerations are woven into global mobility policies and who's going on assignment and how that assignment is structured, for example. Taking into account things like equal pay, equal benefits. There's lots and lots of legislation around the world for that. But, you know, specifically when it comes to global mobility, things like, for example, the Posted Worker Directive, which covers temporary working in another jurisdiction. What that gives is kind of making sure that you're looking at the same kind of working hours in the country that you're working in. Things like, you know, for example, our national minimum wage in the UK, you're getting the minimum wage that you should be getting in that country. So naturally, global mobility brings with it considerations around broader sort of legislation, such as the Posted Worker Directive. And then also Brian touched there on kind of virtual assignments. So a natural way to sort of think about the sort of sustainability aspect is to reduce business travel, is to sort of reduce the carbon footprint of an organization by saying we won't travel as much or we won't have as many face-to-face meetings on a global basis. But you've got to think about the kind of health and well-being and the social considerations of that, because if you've got an individual who maybe operates as part of a global team, they're based in a location on their own. If they're only undertaking virtual meetings from a social perspective, is that the right thing for that person? It might be, but from a, you know, it might not be. So I think there's those sorts of considerations we're seeing organisations sort of try to take into account in terms of their approach to global mobility and any refined global mobility policies that they're looking to bring in.
Joe, if I can just sort of ask you on a very sort of practical level, communicating these issues, I mean, how important is it to be transparent about where you are as an organization on these things? And I guess what are the risks if you don't get that right? Because again, you've covered a lot in terms of what your policy must look like. How do you align that with good communication?
Yeah, it's a good point, Rob. And I think, as with anything with a workforce, communication is the key. Employees, line managers, people who are responsible for the people within an organization need to understand why decisions are made, particularly when it comes to such emotive issues that are linked to anything to do with ESG. So it's absolutely imperative that communication happens. So if we take the example of maybe some of the sort of sustainable and environmental sort of changes that an organization might want to make, that's that's becoming more and more important to a workforce. So it's really important for them to understand why those decisions might be taken, what's important about them. That can be such an important kind of employee engagement and retention. You would want them to know why you're offering a particular benefit or why you're not allowing so much business travel. So communication is absolutely key.
If I may add to that, I actually love that comment, Joe, because we are seeing, and particularly in the Netherlands with the younger workforce, that they are increasingly aware, and I almost want to say demanding, that employees have a transparent ESG policy. It's part of their considerations to even join a company. So it is, I guess, of increasing importance that companies are transparent about their ESG goals, their direction and their objectives in that sense.
No, thanks, Brian. Exactly as you both alluded to, getting the right framework in place is one part of what needs to be done, but getting all the messaging out is also so critical. And with that, I'd like Marlene to turn to you. You're in your role as Director of Corporate Governance and Culture. I'd just be really interested in some of your views on the governance aspects and the considerations that you're looking at with businesses as they try and improve their governance around global mobility.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to share some of my views on this item. Well, actually, talking about global mobility, talking about ESG, you can see that a lot of developments are resulting from the change from a shareholder towards a stakeholder model. And actually, well, I think the developments around ESG are kind of a convergence between the two models, so to say, where we were focusing in the 1970s on the shareholder model, focusing on getting profits and paying dividends. There's much more to do now, and it's definitely not sufficient anymore. And we will have to work with our stakeholders because we need them, they need us. And so actually it's about having a solid supply chain in place, having a good relationship with the governments, with clients, consumers, and of course with your employees. And actually, I really think that the brain power of your employees is the capital of your company. And it doesn't, and then you need to show who you really are as an entity. You need to show to your stakeholders what is your character, what is your true identity. It definitely does not end with your name on the door or your name on the socials or whatever, or a nice campaign. I don't think that's sufficient anymore. So your stakeholders want to know, who are you? What is your identity? What are your core values? And how do you deal with your core values? For instance, where is it shown in your day-to-day work, in your day-to-day policies? How do you deal with your staff? What do you do when your company is under pressure? And what do you do if you have to lay off staff for any reason? Well, so it's much more than relating also to Joe's comments on the communication. That's crucial, actually. That's where your real character is being shown. Perhaps I may give you a few examples. Just look at Patagonia, which is a very interesting company, and they have declared Earth as their only shareholder. Now, that's a very clear position-taking statement where they really say, well, we all are very convinced that we have to be much more than just paying a profit. We really are a part of a bigger system, and we have to take care of the system as a whole. And another example, for instance, is a company like Shell. And Shell, of course, they are very much focused on fossils, and they are very much aware that they had to change their business model. Apparently, we saw in some publications, they have some real struggles now to find the correct staff, especially under younger, talented people. So they are facing consequences of the choices they have made in the past. Like same example is Heineken, who has apparently been disappearing from all the list of most favorable employers in the Netherlands. So you can really see that decisions you take have impact on the position in the world for your stakeholders, but also in the world of getting the right talent on board. And that also impacts, of course, the area around your global mobility, because it's all about making right choices. And then if you talk about choices, it's also about taking ownership in this area and make sure that people know what to do. And that you define a clear strategy, for instance, as a board, where, of course, your core values should be the start again. I mean, you cannot define a strategy without relating to your core values. And there you can clearly explain how your view is on DEI, how you touch upon your hiring and remuneration and mobility policies. Of course, I have experienced rather often that companies see the development of policies and procedures as a burden. And yes, it can be a burden, but it's only on the short term, because the process around the development of those policies also relates to the fact that you have to make choices and that you have to stick to them, and you have to make a clear definition of who you are, where you want to go, and how you're going to get there. So develop your policy framework and make sure it's part of your corporate hygiene. And update more frequently than only 2 to 5 years or so, because the world is moving very fast. And then finally, let's go to the role of the executive board and the supervisory board, because of course they are defining the tone at the top, the tone from the top, also in relation to global mobility. And if you are able to define some clarity regarding international assignments and how to go about what is acceptable, where do you tolerate any deviations or not, that's where it's really helpful. Because it might take some unpopular decisions, and you need really courage. You really need a backbone to stick to decisions you have made. But it will result in clarity. You will build trust. You will gain trust, and if you are a trustworthy party, also for your employees, but also for your stakeholders, it will create value, a lot of value at the very end.
No, thanks, Marlene. You've covered a lot in there. I might just, if I can, just follow up on one aspect there, which you were just talking about, which is the sort of importance of having a sort of tax and social security framework. This is something I think saw during the pandemic, when there were a situation that sort of came on companies, suddenly, where they had people all over the world and had to respond, very quickly. How do you see the sort of entire strategy and approach? How does all of that fit together?
Well, you really need to have one big overall approach, I think, especially when your company is operating on a global level. You need to have some kind of consistency in your approach, because otherwise you'll get lost. companies or your stakeholders don't know where you want to go. And if you have a global overall approach, it will create consistency, it will create trust, it will be, you have your right tone at the top developed. Everybody knows what is being expected and where they can go. And I really highly recommend to build your frameworks and to develop them in an appropriate way. And it's not just about the result of the frameworks, but it's also about the internal discussions and the process to get to the framework as a result, because that's where you can all have the right angle in place, and you can have the discussions about possible discrepancies, differences in culture, for instance, which are also crucial for, that's at least how I feel.
No, thank you.
I don't know, perhaps Brian might want to add to that.
Thanks, Marlene. I agree with you completely. There's a definite tone at the top that's important, and the governance aspects creating that framework, but it also has to be interconnected. Business has to understand what is going on during an international assignment and what are the things that need to be dealt with and taken care of. And that can only happen if you have that consistent back and forth and those discussions internally. So yeah, I agree completely.
Rich, with that in mind, can I perhaps just turn to you? We've drilled into with Marlene and Brian and Joe, what's going on in the world of global mobility. I'd just be interested in perhaps how some of the experiences you have across the sort of broader organizational framework is what we're talking about in this context. Is it consistent with what you see elsewhere, whether within the employment space or more broadly, other areas where the priorities are a little bit different? I'd just be interested in sort of stepping back to get that broader perspective.
I think so. So I mean, we've covered a few different things here, and what you tend to find with ESG is that I tend to refer to it as the law of unintended consequences. You might make some good decisions about potentially, say, cutting down on air travel or moving from business class to standard travel and sort of saving 4 times the carbon there. But we've touched on the fact that there's a social inclusion element to this and a health and welfare side of things as well. So what we're starting to see people do is effectively not just have a financial budget, but if it's something like climate, have that carbon budget as well. So there's not necessarily everything's black and white, but there is a sort of a richness of decision making across, which then sort of ties back to Marlene's point here that you have to have and culture is absolutely key as well as governance, because ESG is a change management program at heart, to be honest, and there is an element of culture that comes that people have to want to make those decisions. They have to want to say, if I'm traveling, then I'm going to make more out of this journey, which might mean that you're away for slightly longer, but then you're back for longer. So it's changing those habits of a lifetime, potentially, and making informed decisions. And it doesn't have to be a black or a white. It might be, I'm flying short haul, so I'm just going to go normal travel. Brian mentioned particularly in Europe, trains and things like that, the availability of trains and things. So we're seeing it permeate all levels of the organization, and that's being able to talk to your customers, your employees, and wider stakeholders on what you're doing and why, and living the values and showing that is key. And it really is affecting talent attraction in the first place, as we've touched on this call.
I like the idea that sort of it's a change management sort of challenge, really. I think that's a good way to see it. And I also like the idea that there's the trade-off aspect of it. And Joe, I was going to come to you because I think we talk about quite a lot in mobility about the purpose of getting the right people into the right places, but that itself, there's a lot of complexity in terms of the business needs, the individual's needs. I'd again just be interested in kind of how you're seeing your companies that you deal with, how are they evaluating that? Is that changing? What are they using to guide them through that decision-making process?
That's probably quite a big question, Rob. And I think we're sort of seeing organisations address that in different ways. As I said, in the last couple of years, there's been sort of a natural reason to start reassessing lots of different policies, and that encompasses global mobility, but that's often part of a sort of a bigger process that organisations are going through, where they're reviewing their a lot of policies within the HR function, including their talent one, and that incorporates things like D&I, as we talked about earlier. So it's a process that's happening in a lot of companies. A lot of companies, they are looking at these sorts of things naturally. There's been a natural reason for them to do that. Just thinking about some of the topics that we thought about today, particularly thinking about ESG and particularly sort of the sustainability aspect. Those are things from a global mobility perspective that we are seeing organisations genuinely want to try to incorporate into their policies and processes for international assignments or business travel or global remote work. I think it's probably fair to say, though, that not every global mobility function or global mobility team knows how to achieve that. So there's definitely a desire to do it, but there's not necessarily the knowledge of how to achieve that. So I would say it's probably quite a slow process. Interestingly, Rich and I did a session at the end of last year where we asked the audience how far along the journey they were in sort of incorporating ESG and particularly sustainability into their global mobility policies. And we had only 19% at that point say that they were quite a way there. The rest were in the very much unsure, not yet, or very, very early stages. So that just gives a sense of where we found our client base to be.
Yeah, interesting to see where that indicates they are on the journey. Marlene or Brian, any final comments from either of you?
Yeah, well, I would like indeed to add on Joe's message that there's a difference between knowing what to do. You first have to find out what you have to do, but then the second part of it is the fact, well, how are you going to get there? And indeed, that's the change process that is required. And that requires different competencies, different capacities from the persons involved. And it's nice to have a sparring partner around who can help you with the how and not only with the what, so to say. So we can see that a lot is happening there, and that a lot of companies are seeking some advice in this area. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's actually brings it together very well, because that really wraps up with what Rich was alluding to at the start, which was there's a journey here and there's a process around establishing what your key issues are in the first instance. And then, of course, once you've established your key issues, there's then that issue around, well, how are we going to measure how we're tracking on that journey? So with that, I'm going to draw things to a close to give us time to deal with the questions that have come in from everybody. So Marlene, Brian, thank you very much. Joe, Rich, great to have you both here. And we look forward to talking through some of the questions. So thanks everybody very much. Oh, thanks everybody. That was some great discussion. We've covered an enormous amount of ground there. Just a note, I've got a few questions that have been coming in so far, but if there's any other questions that have occurred to people listening to any parts of those discussions, shoot those in through the Q&A and we'd love to hear from you. We've got a few to kick us off. I've got one here, Rich, it's a very good question actually, and I think it's really quite a topical question. We hear this a lot. And the question, I think, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is really referring to what's the risk that the organizational initiatives that companies take, they could be considered greenwashing, and we hear that term. How do you manage that risk? What's the thought process and the consideration process you need to go? Because I think that's it's a good question and quite a good one to start our discussion with.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's very topical. It's certainly very topical from a sort of UK perspective as well in an EU perspective.
perspective with sort of the taxonomies that are coming in, some of the things we see. It's about absolute clarity. So it's genuinely being transparent about what it is that you're seeking to do. I think I'd also add that you need to be seeking to do something as well. So obviously when people are talking about carbon reduction targets now, if there's a sole reliance on something like offsetting, you know, and you don't really have any specific activity, you're always going to get sort of, there's going to be an element of greenwashing leveled at you. So you've got to be absolutely transparent about what it is and why you're doing it. And then it needs a sensible framework. So some of the problems that we've seen with people talking about sustainable products is they've not really defined what they mean by a sustainable product. So that kind of leaves you open to people pulling at threads and sort of throwing mud your way, if you like, over something that might be genuinely aspirational and good. So it needs a sensible framework, and you need to have clearly defined some of the terms in there as well. And then the final thing, final couple of things really, don't overpromise. So don't make it, any activity is going to be sensible and good activity. There is no need to sort of gild the lily, for want of a better expression. So don't overpromise. And then finally, you can get external assurance, and a lot of organisations are looking for that third-party assurance that basically says, are we doing what we're saying on the tin effectively? And there's somebody else has looked at that and said, yes, it's credible. So, but it really does come down to transparency about what you're trying to achieve, why, and having that sensible framework around it that might have terms defined and things like that, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Marlene, this might tie in. I've got another question here, which might tie in a little bit perhaps to what Rich was just talking about. And that's, I think you mentioned in your remarks, the supervisory board and the role of that board in this context about global mobility, but it probably goes wider. And I'd just kind of be interested, does that have an overlap with, I think the question really is, what's the role? But interestingly, does that have an overlap with kind of what Rich was talking about there?
Yeah, definitely, of course. As a supervisory board, in fact, you have three key roles. It's the role of the supervisor, of course. You're a sparring partner or an advisor, but also an employer to the CEO, to the executive board. And you also are responsible for supervision and sometimes approval on the remuneration policies, for instance. Now, if we focus on the employer role, I think that might be the most important one, also taking into account this topic of this webinar. First of all, you were speaking about tying in your compensation to ESG and your corporate strategy. Then you can define certain key performance indicators, and well, let's be honest, the topic we're talking about is for everyone quite new. So you might start with a trial and error kind of approach to develop, how are things going? What's your performance? What can you achieve within a short period of time? And how realistic are the goals that have been defined? Then the second part, which is also linking to the former message about clear communication, make the link public, at least within your own organization, but also external publications certainly will help, because it will prove the importance of ESG. And there you can also stimulate and enforce the tone at the top and the tone from the top, actually. So you have to define some clear and ambitious ESG related goals. And then you also have to take that into account when you talk about recruitment, about training, development, strategic planning, performance management and stuff. So I'm talking about hiring director, CEO, what are the requirements over there? Then of course, the supervisory role is very much in line with this. And I mean, I could further elaborate on that one as well, but I think I'll leave it at that right now.
No, thank you. Brian, I've got another question here, which is an EU, actually related to, I think, a measures announced, I think it's the Council of the EU, and the pay transparency directive that I think has been issued recently. The question is really looking there, I think, at, what's the does that have a direct impact? What is that impact? I think is the question there, Brian.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I think there in international situations, it is not quite clear yet what that impact is going to be. There is a recent publication of a directive supporting equal pay within the European Union, but oddly enough, there's no mention of how that impacts international movements or secondments or postings. Those terms don't appear in there. So I think it will be very much up to looking at what are going to be the local requirements, local legislation. If you're going from country A to country B, that you need to be aware that you may be impacted by the local regulations in that other country, even though you have agreed terms and conditions based on what you are used to having in your home country. So I think there's a wide open field there for consideration. Fact of the matter is that that directive is going to take effect, and we will have to adhere to it either locally in the home country or in the host country.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Brian, I've got one here that's come in, and you mentioned this in your remarks, and I'm interested also in Joe's comments on this one as well. But perhaps we'll go to you first, Brian, and expanding a little bit on some of your remarks in the session earlier. Talent retention. How critically you're seeing this, and how important is it in terms of talent retention? And I suppose even more importantly, what are you seeing that is an effective way to manage that? So maybe we'll go to you on this one, Brian, and then Joe can add some comments.
Thanks, Rob. How long do we have? There's a lot that can be said and talked about on this. I think what we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, is that particularly the younger workforce are very much interested in what companies are doing in terms of ESG, and that is actually a consideration for them to or to not join a company, wanting that transparency, wanting to understand what the sustainability objectives are. In terms of retention, I think we're not quite there yet, but there is the phenomenon of the green resignation, as we could call it, so that people or younger workforce may actually decide to leave a company because they cannot identify with their ESG goals. Not saying that we're there yet, but I think we're going to reach that point eventually. If we translate that to international mobility, there's always a bit of a paradox there, because international mobility basically means that there's international travel, there's movement. So how sustainable is that movement? How environmentally conscious do you want to be? Do you want to have people traveling over the world? With what frequency? How do you want them traveling? Maybe we need to limit it. Maybe we have to have virtual assignments. In terms of translating that to retention, and that's why I say it, younger workforce, oddly enough, they want to have the opportunity to travel and maybe go on short-term assignments or longer-term assignments, because they see that also as a possibility of career progression. So I think it's going to be a challenge to find that right balance between ESG goals, being transparent about that, showing the workforce what you stand for and how they can play a role in that. I think that's also very important, and how that balances out with the desire to travel and to gain international experience through those assignments. So there is actually a lot to talk about.
There's a lot to cover, Joe. I could maybe just turn to you, whether your experience is similar to Brian's, and also perhaps as well, what finds its way into the global mobility program at the moment, and how different does that look to what it looked like, back in 2019, for example?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So just on the first point about sort of talent retention, obviously Brian covered, a huge amount there and gave a really comprehensive answer. So I just agree with everything Brian said, really, and just say that it's certainly something that we're seeing with our clients, a talent retention perspective, an employee engagement perspective, also a talent attraction perspective. So, all of those groups of individuals really do want to understand what the ESG commitments and aims are of the organisation that they are either working for or potentially want to work with. So certainly I would agree with Brian that, you know, ESG considerations are certainly becoming more and more paramount when we think about anything to do with talent, whether that's retention, attraction, or the engagement of the existing group of employees. Your question around global mobility, we sort of touched on various aspects earlier on in the webinar, but certainly, you know, lots of organisations are trying to incorporate sort of the various strands of ESG within their global mobility policy. It's kind of an obvious area when you think about some of the more obvious points, such as, you know, as Brian mentioned, travel. There's an obvious linkage there with carbon. There's the social considerations when you work more and more as part of global virtual teams. So sort of thinking about well-being as you kind of integrate with those sorts of global teams. There's the governance point that Marlene mentioned around sort of tax and social security. We've talked about various directives such as Posted Worker Directive, Pay Transparency Directive. So I think global mobility is kind of an obvious area for an organisation to try and incorporate sort of the various strands of ESG or try to make a start on that. And certainly we are seeing in our client base that organisations are doing that. Some more further progressed than others, again, as we touched on a little bit earlier on in the webinar.
No, thanks, Jo. Marlene, I've got a question here which I'd like to pass on to you. And I think if I summarise it, it picks up a couple of the comments from the discussion. The first one was when Rich was saying we're talking about a sort of change management program. And then Brian also mentioned, I think, you know, it's not necessarily a zero sum in many situations. So I'd be really interested from your point of view, how do you help organisations and how do organisations manage and work through these dilemmas? Because there's a lot of decision making, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about how you do get the consistency in the decisions you want, and how you get the overall consistency with the strategy and the objectives. So yeah, your thoughts on that would be great.
Yes, of course, happy to share. Indeed, well, this is a process in which we are inventing or developing new approaches. It's really new common ground for all of us. But where's the common area, the aspect in this case? So I feel that it's key to incorporate your staff and the brain power of your staff and the development of the new approaches and your new policies as well. So it would be, I really would advise to invite your staff to share ideas, to come up with possible other points of views, and also include, for instance, an approach like scenario planning, and include that in your strategy setting meetings where you can have your scenarios in place. You can also decide and discuss the possible impact of your scenarios. And I really feel that it's not just you are creating a lot of commitment, because people can share their views and their ideas, and they feel seen, they feel recognized and acknowledged, because you are really taking account of taking their views into account. But you can also try to define the early adapters within your company to find out, well, where do you want to go? And do we share some views and perceptions in this? Because they also have their circle of influence, and they will discuss with their colleagues as well where to go and how to get there. So that might be helpful. And from another point of view, it's of course we do not only talk about the content and the details, the impact, the facts and figures, but we also should discuss the process on how to get there. And indeed, a careful decision-making process has a lot of value. If you can show to the outside world or to your environment that you are carefully weighing all the arguments, that you do not have all the answers up front, because we are not perfect. It's new area for all of us. Then you feel they will more often be prepared to accept the answer or the solution, even if it's not the answer they are really looking for, or they would prefer. And then finally, of course, the communication area, which we already addressed. And I would suggest to lay down carefully the arguments and the process you have chosen, and all the options and arguments and facts and figures, so that you can still explain later on decisions you've made and the rationale behind them.
No, thank you. Rich, I've got one here in the little bit of time we've got left. It's a big question, but I'd certainly be interested in getting some perspective. And I think the core of this question is for a global organization, when you're trying to work your way through this journey, there's going to be different cultural issues, different impacts, depending where you do business around the world. And it probably goes a little bit to what Marlene was talking about. How do global organizations manage, I suppose, what I might call the competing interests around the world, the different factors, the different stages of development that their various business activities and their organizations might be, depending where in the world they do business. So perhaps just an overview on that one in the time we've got left would be great, Rich.
Yeah, so it's a good one. It's obviously a complex area to look at as well, but I think it's when the group, if you like, sets its strategy, it needs to sort of further to Marlene's point, it needs to have engaged with the different geographies and entities within its group, and in doing that, it'll flush out the risks and the opportunities across ESG, and of course, some of those will aggregate up to the group strategies, and then form some kind of reporting process at a group level, and some of them will be left at a business and regional level. So there will be a focus at group and an aggregation of those risks, impacts and outputs, but also at a business unit level, they might have risks that are singular to themselves that they need to be completely focused on and dealing with themselves as well. So the trick is to have that blend of, if you like, regional and business unit responsibility that is specific to that geography and the operations of that entity, but have enough common ground that the group can actually report on the aggregated impact of the organization. And then, with enough flex then for those organizations, because some might be more mature than others if you've just had an acquisition or it's a different geography, understanding why that different entity is focusing on and prioritizing on the things it is doing, and to the point made earlier, you can't do everything all at once, and there is an understanding that there will be things that you are doing where you have a mature understanding and operations, then something slightly less mature. And what we're seeing now on reporting is people calling that out. We really understand this. We've had a huge focus on it for 2 years. We don't necessarily understand question B. That's where we're focused. And question C, that's for next year, because we've got to focus on these areas and do them well. So it is complex. And then it's having the governance structures and the reporting structures from group through to the business units. But increasingly, we're seeing that those business units and geographies effectively looking after their own affairs within that common framework, and making sure that they're doing things in the local communities that resonate with them, as well as managing the risks and opportunities.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a really, really good summary and some good sort of direction setters for people as they start to think about it. No, thanks, Rich. Got a couple of minutes. I'll just give anybody there, Joe, Brian, Marlene, any sort of closing comments anyone else would like to make?
Thanks, Rob. I think just to reiterate what Rich said, I really liked the approach, sort of tearing down from corporate strategy and then over the regions. That's something that we see quite often with mobility policies as well. There's one governing policy, and then it sort of filters down through the organization. And it's about getting that transparency and that communication flow going back and forth, knowing where you stand and what needs to be done.
No, with that, if no other closing comment, Rich, Brian, Joe, Marlene, thank you all very much. I think that's been a tremendous discussion. I think hopefully for all of you listening out there, we've started to help you think about the change management, think about the journey, think about how to manage the process. And we look forward to hearing how it all progresses. Our contact details are there. We always love to hear from you, even if it's just questions and comments. Always really wonderfully appreciated. So with that, thank you all very much for listening, and that ends today's broadcast.